Hello everyone, today we are going to study a greatest elegy of our time or of previous time, In Memoriam, written by Alfred Tennyson. In Memoriam is one of the 5 greatest elegies in English language. A dear friend of Tennyson, Arthur Henry Hallam, has passed away, and In Memoriam is a collection of poems written in the aftermath of this profound loss. Tennyson wrote the many sections of In Memoriam to mourn the death of his friend Arthur Henry Hallam, who had been his college mate at Cambridge and who afterwards got engaged to Tennyson's sister Emily, though his sudden and premature death prevented the marriage. The poem consists of a prologue, an epilogue, and 131 sections which Tennyson called short swallow flights of a song, and which were composed at intervals over a period of about 17 years from 1833 to 1849. In Memoriam differs from other great elegies in that it was never conceived as a single whole. The poem's struggle with grief, despair, faith and doubt are reflected all through. Although the poem has been thought to have been more defined by spiritual uncertainty than confidence, it is perhaps best summarized by the well-known quote from the 27th segment that says, "It is better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." There is a long history of elegiac poetry, that is, poems written on the occasion of someone's death. Poems about death are generally concerned not just with the loss, but also with what remains after a person dies. An elegy can mourn one specific person, such as Walt Whitman's poem When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, on the death of Abraham Lincoln, or it can also mourn humanity in general, as in Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard. In the pastoral elegy, modelled on the ancient Greek poets Theocritus and Bion, the subject and friends are depicted as shepherds living in a pastoral world in classical times. Famous pastoral elegies are Milton's Lycidas on King Edward, Shelley's Adonais written on John Keats, and Matthew Arnold's Thyrsis on Arthur Hugh Clough. Through elegies, poets often take the opportunity to touch upon many important and deeply felt concerns of society. Traditionally, an elegy includes 3 stages of loss. The first is an expression of grief. The second is full of praise for the deceased person. The third contains consolation and solace. In Memoriam was intended as an elegy or a poem in memory and praise of one who has died. As such, it contains all of the elements of a traditional pastoral elegy, such as Milton's Lycidas, including ceremonial mourning for the dead, praise of his virtues, and consolation for his loss. Moreover, all statements by the speaker can be understood as personal statements by the poet himself. Like most elegies, In Memoriam begins with expressions of sorrow and grief, followed by the poet's recollection of a happy past spent with the individual he is now mourning. These fond recollections led the poet to question the powers in the universe that could allow a good person to die, which gives way to more general reflections on the meaning of life. Eventually, the poet's attitude shifts from grief to resignation. Finally, in the climax, he realizes that his friend is not lost forever but survives in another higher form. The poem closes with a celebration of this transcendent survival. Tennyson's poetic output covers a breadth that is difficult to comprehend in a single system of thematic concern. His various works treat issues of political and historical concern as well as scientific matters, classical mythology, and deeply personal thoughts and feelings. Tennyson is both a poet of penetrating introspection and a poet of the people. He plumbs the depths of his own consciousness while also giving voice to the national consciousness of Victorian society. As a child, Tennyson was influenced profoundly by the poetry of Byron and Scott, and his earliest poems reflect the lyric intensity and meditative expressiveness of his romantic forebearers. Not only is Tennyson a poet of the natural and psychological landscape, he also attends frequently to the past and historical events. The Lady Charlotte and the poems within Idylls of the King take place in medieval England and capture a world of knights in shining armor and their damsels in distress. In addition to treating the history of his nation, Tennyson also explores the mythological past, as articulated in classical works of Homer, Virgil, and Dante. His Ulysses and the Lotos-Eaters draw upon actual incidents in Homer's Odyssey. Likewise, his Ode to Virgil abounds with allusions to incidents in the great poet's Aeneid, especially the fall of Troy. Tennyson thus looked both to historical and mythological pasts as repositories for his poetry. Not just an elegy and an epithalamion, the poem is also a deeply philosophical reflection on religion, science, and the promise of immortality. Tennyson's In Memoriam struggles with the relationship between faith and knowledge. It asks questions about the possibility of human progress, about suffering and hope, and it deals in the widest scope of meaning of life and death. Tennyson was deeply troubled by the proliferation of scientific knowledge about the origins of life and human progress. While he was writing this poem, Sir Charles Lyell published his Principles of Geology, which undermined the biblical creation story, and Robert Chambers published his early evolutionary tract, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. In Memoriam, Tennyson insisted that we hold fast to our faith in a higher power in spite of our inability to prove God's existence, believing where we cannot prove. He reflects early revolutionary theories in his faith that man, through a process lasting millions of years, is developing into something greater. In the end, Tennyson replaces the doctrine of the immortality of the soul with the immortality of mankind through evolution, thereby achieving a synthesis between his profound religious faith and the new scientific ideas of his day. In Memoriam also reflects Tennyson's struggle with the Victorians' growing awareness of another sort of past, the vast expanse of geological time and evolutionary history. The new discoveries in biology, astronomy and geology of that time implied a view of humanity that much distressed many Victorians, including Tennyson. In Maud, for example, he describes the stars as cold fires yet with power to burn and brand his nothingness into man. Unlike the Romantics, he possessed a painful awareness of the brutality and indifference of nature read in tooth and claw. Although Tennyson associated evolution with progress, he also worried that the notion seemed to contradict the biblical story of creation and long held assumptions about man's place in the world. Nonetheless, in Memoriam, he insists that we must keep our faith despite the latest discoveries of science. He writes, "Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen they face by faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove." At the end of the poem, he concludes that God's eternal plan includes purposive biological development. Thus, he reassures his Victorian readers that the new science does not mean the end of old faith. Tennyson also spoke to his Victorian contemporaries about issues of urgent social and political concern. In The Princess, he addresses the relations between the sexes and argues for women's rights in higher education. In The Charge of the Light Brigade, he speaks out in favor of a controversial diplomatic maneuver, the disastrous charges on the Russian army by British troops in the Crimean War. Thus, for all his love of the past, Tennyson also maintained a lively interest in the developments of his day, remaining deeply committed to reforming the society in which he lived and to which he gave voice. The poem In Memoriam is not only a moving and poignant expression of the poet's private grief and his deep love for Hallam, but also a vehicle for the expression of those anxieties which were occupying the minds of numerous intellectual people of the first half of 19th century. The poem reflects the Victorian conflict between faith and doubt. It was due to the result of the pre-Darwinian and Darwinian theories that shook the religious belief of many people at that time. In Memoriam is a representative poem because it expresses the spiritual uncertainty and doubt which not only he himself experienced, but which numerous other people in the Victorian age also experienced. The age was shaken by new scientific discoveries, by theories of evolution, by historical criticism of the Bible, and a general breakdown of old religious, ethical and social beliefs. Nobody can deny the feelings of grief, anguish, distress, disappointment, and despair in the poem In Memoriam. At the outset of the poem, Tennyson wants to remain fixed in grief. He resists the process of time by which grief may be conquered. He is even ready to identify himself with the yew tree as a symbol of unchanging gloom. In fact, he identifies his love for Hallam with his grief over Hallam's death. By the time the ship brings Hallam's dead body to England, the poet's grief has already turned into a calm despair. Just when he wishes to believe in immortality and trust that good shall fall at last to all and every winter should change to spring, he feels extremely troubled by doubt as he asks, "But what am I?" And the answer is an agonizing one. An infant crying in the night, an infant crying for the light. The poet's belief in immortality begin to falter. He writes, "I falter where I firmly trod." He also doubts God as he sees nature arrayed in tooth and claw. Thus, the poet gives a poetic utterance to the doubt created in his mind by the evolutionary theories of the mind. After dealing with his reminiscences of his life with Hallam at Cambridge University, the poet's thoughts once again turn towards immortality. In this connection, section 95 describes a mystical experience. While going through Hallam's old letters, the poet suddenly feels that Hallam's soul has descended and the two souls have become intertwined. Both the souls then soar to heavenly heights of thoughts and find the ultimate reality and essence of things. At last, this trance and the ecstasy of it comes to an end, while the night has given way to the twilight of the dawn. Tennyson's prologue is a serious theology, even if expressed in the poetic mode. The theological aspect is not an adornment, but rather at the essence of his inquiry. Three theological aspects appear to dominate the poem. First one, revelation or how we may know God. The second one, creation or the manifestation of the divine presence in this world. And the third one, hope, because of Christ, the strong Son of God who came among us. The poem is perceived to have 9 movements, although these sections are not specifically labeled in the poem. The sections can be listed as the first one, stepping stones of grief; second, the burial ship; third, the path forward; the fourth one is eternal life, is it possible? The fifth section deals with steps of doubt and trust. The sixth one is about wandering in dreams of despair and hope. The seventh, inner peace and progress. The eighth one depicts a pilgrimage to a new day, and the ninth one is about hope toward which the whole creation moves. We shall provide introductory remarks concerning each of these sections, tracing especially the existential questioning and theology Tennyson offers us. When we begin with section 1 of Tennyson's poem, we find that there is a great sorrow which dominates the mood, and this, of course, is the reason Tennyson is writing. He raises existential doubt about whether time, grief, and death shall be victorious over love and life's meaning. Some of the images in this section refer to the city life. For example, a bald street, a dark house, doors waiting for the absent friend, and even the chimney in expectation of a guest. But the images from nature are just as strong. The point of these lines is to establish the fact early on in the poem that our lives are lived in the shadow of the yew tree, the shadow of death. The fact of death is established, but what value may we give to it? That is the question Tennyson asks throughout in this section. In section 2, the poet imagines the body of his dead friend being transported home on a fair ship across the placid ocean. Tennyson is symbolizing his need to view the death and burial of his friend in a way enshrined by peace. The ship symbol is well known from Egyptian funeral ships, which sail into eternity with the souls of the dead. By talking about false and true, Tennyson refers to the question of meaning, the question of the world, humankind, God, purpose, and hope. In section 3, the poet thinks back on the walks and talks he had with Hallam. This analogy of the path is as metaphysical as physical. The time spent together included walks and hikes, but also the path of discussion about knowledge and faith. What is lost with the death of his friend is communion and a meaningful life path to be walked. The path is prominent religious and philosophical way of speaking. We are pilgrims seeking meaning, seeking goodness, and seeking God. The path in the numerous stages of In Memoriam is fully religious, fully philosophical. Is there a progress, perhaps even eternal progress? This is the question of section 4 in the poem. Is there personal immortality or is there annihilation? These questions are fully philosophical and fully theological. Tennyson offers speculation about eternity, but knows we have no clear answer. The light and the shadows intertwine, like light reflecting on shadowy pools of water, providing the ambiguity of life's meaning. Section 5 on doubt and trust gives us the heart of the question in a powerful way. It is both high point of faith and low point of doubt and uncertainty. We hear both a complaint and a prayer. Be near me when my light is low, when the blood creeps and the nerves prick and tingle and the heart is sick. In section 6, the poet tries to give meaning to the remembrance of his friend by imagining how the relationship would have continued had Hallam lived longer. This includes some more cheerful thoughts. Tennyson is warmed by his admiration for Hallam, but he imagines that he himself is more lowly figure, hardly worthy of the friendship from one who was destined to a greater role and a greater rank in life. Section 7 refers to the first anniversary of Hallam's death, 1833. For the second time, the poet writes of Christmas. During the first Christmas after the death of his friend, he says that the bells ring out peace and goodwill, but he would almost wish to die before he hears them anymore, for they bring the confusion of sorrow touched with joy. Now he makes progress in accepting the death of Hallam. His spirit is calmer than a year before. In this long section of the poem, he develops the feeling of continued communion and communication with his lost friend. Tennyson remembers places where they had spent time together and now imagines an ongoing dialogue between them. His great sorrow is now mixed with a kind of thankfulness. This short section, which is the 8th section, was written in 1837. At the time, the Tennyson family moved from Somersby to High Beach at Epping Forest. The move becomes symbolic in the poem for the starting of a new day. This part and the rest of the poem turn outward toward the world, dealing with themes of social change, natural and cultural evolution, as well as progress in faith. The theme in the last section of the poem speculates about great hope for humanity, including scientific, ethical, and spiritual progress. Let us now look at the last theme. The last section is longer and wraps together all what the poet wants to say. It opens with a third Christmas, this time strange, because the poet now lives in another place and he realizes on Christmas Eve that these are not the bells I know, but the poet is far more cheerful and optimistic than in the previous times. He says that they should celebrate not Hallam's death but his birth. New Year is now added to Christmas. The poem comes to a heightened end with the thought that everything is cooperating towards some good purpose. Indeed, while the poem begins with a death, it ends with a wedding. As Tennyson himself wrote, it is rather the cry of the whole human race than mine. It begins with a funeral and ends with a marriage, begins with a death and ends in promise of new life. Characteristically, throughout In Memoriam, Alfred Tennyson employs the imagery of natural elements in order to portray his feelings and emotions after the death of his close friend Arthur Henry Hallam. Perhaps the most poignant of these images is that of the wind, represented in many ways throughout the poem, coupled with autumnal imagery such as the faded leaf, the chestnut, and the leaves that redden to the fall, symbolizing the passing of time, the end of life, and moving into death. While Wordsworth had seen nature with the eyes of the poet only, Tennyson sees it with the eyes of a scientist as well. In the conclusion, I would like to say we can proclaim that Tennyson, with his poetic expertise, rises above and beyond his personal loss and sorrow and reaches a unique universal stature to which even readers of today can relate. Thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed today's lesson and I would be seeing you in the next session.